You have been listening there to President Trump delivering that presidential address to the nation about the war against Iran. And you heard the president there lay out what we've heard from him to a large degree in the past as well. But on the timeline of the war, suggested that it may last 2 to 3 weeks longer. He again here threatened to obliterate Iran while also talking about the possibility for diplomacy moving forward and described the timeline here as wrapping up perhaps shortly. He, of course, addressed the 13 U.S. service members who were killed in this war as well. I want to bring in our White House correspondent, Monica Alba, who was watching all of this. The president, again, Monica, we have heard some of this in the past. The president has done these Q&As with full reporters in the Oval Office and elsewhere at the White House. He gives remarks where he speaks about the war fairly frequently. And that is what a lot of Americans heard in this primetime speech tonight.
Exactly, Hallie. This was meant to be, it seems, a broader recap to the American public of statements that the president and the White House and the Trump administration have really been making over the last couple of weeks. There wasn't any major, huge new announcement about the overall goals or objectives. There was an indication from the president about the timeline, which, of course, has been the subject of a lot of discussion, given the fact that even weeks ago, when this did begin, the president was the one that was framing this as potentially being wrapped up very quickly, very soon, in the very near future. And at times, he said that would be in a matter of weeks, maybe in a matter of days. And now tonight, he is saying, according to his own military objectives that he set out at the beginning of this massive military operation, that it looks like that could be completed very shortly in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But the president is trying to essentially portray to the American people that he believes almost enough has been achieved, not everything necessarily, because he said in the next couple of weeks that the U.S. is going to hit Iran potentially harder than they have been hit up until this point, with those thousands of targets that have already been attacked, and with the goals of the Iranian Navy essentially being annihilated, in addition to hitting their missile program. But the president also, Hallie, what struck me tonight, this was the first time that he gave a primetime address since the start of this conflict now almost 5 weeks ago. His first videos announcing this were posted on social media, and he has talked about this at almost every event that he has held in the last 30-plus days. This was almost a speech for people who hadn't necessarily been following that. And there may not be that many people, there may not be that many voters, there may not be that many Americans who were just tuning in for the first time, looking to see and get new information, which the president did not necessarily provide. He mentioned, Hallie, this idea that there is this dual track of the possibility for negotiations, which we know have been going on, at least through intermediaries in Pakistan. We know that, according to a source familiar with the discussions, Vice President Vance has been in touch with those intermediaries as recently as yesterday to deliver a message similar to the one that you just heard the president make, which is that they believe there is still the opportunity to make a deal with Tehran, to make a deal potentially here as some kind of an op-ramp that can happen, again, in parallel with the other military objectives that are still being pursued. But I do want to also just note, Hallie, that as we do sit here at the almost 5-week point, initially the timeline for this was estimated from the president, from the White House, to be about a 4 to 6 week timeline. And if he is saying that this is going to extend another 2 or 3 weeks, that could perhaps go beyond that initial time frame. Hallie.
Monica, I was just about to ask you about that, too, the timeline piece of it, because the president was consistent about that early on when this war began, 4 to 6 weeks, now 2 to 3, he's saying further, at a time when this war has not been popular with the majority of Americans. We have seen that reflected again and again in polling. We're going to talk more, too, and you heard the president address everything with the Strait of Hormuz. He is hoping that maybe allies can come help out on that front. He is suggesting a number of things related to the oil situation. Tankers basically paralyzed because they can't get through this key waterway. And here at home, gas prices have spiked. It's frustrating, I think, to some Americans, even with the majority of Republicans supporting this military action that the president has undertaken.
And he did acknowledge that particular pain point from Americans who have seen their gas tanks and the prices to fill them up really shoot up and skyrocket. And the administration has been trying to indicate that this is a short-term pain that people will be feeling, that eventually it will come back down. But as we did see them exceed $4 on average nationwide, that was a really interesting comment from the president. Again, trying to sort of justify this, saying he does believe that they're going to come down, but it's completely unclear when that might actually happen. And to your point about the Strait of Hormuz and specifically allies that were not consulted in the lead up to announcing this major military operation in Iran, the president has for weeks sort of done this diplomatic dare, telling them he wants them at times to help with the Strait of Hormuz, specifically to ensure safe passage for vessels and for tankers. And then when they didn't essentially come to his aid, he said that he didn't need their help, that he didn't even want their help, and that he wasn't seeking it anymore. Now he is sort of framing this and making the argument that if the United States doesn't do anything about the Strait of Hormuz, that it won't be an issue for the United States, when it would be. And when we do know that other countries have certainly indicated that they do want to ensure that vessels and tankers can pass through there, but that this isn't their war, not our war, is the way that some of these foreign ministers and leaders have put it. But it is notable, Hallie, that just today the president said in an interview that he was absolutely considering withdrawing from NATO, from that incredibly important alliance, which we should point out is not something he could do unilaterally. He could not do that on his own. He would have to ask Congress potentially to do that. And right now there are absolutely no indications that something like that would pass. But the president did have some criticism for these countries that he does believe should step up and do more. But he didn't go as far as talking necessarily about the possibility of pulling the U.S. out of that treaty organization.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.